Nobody would be complaining about drug enforcement if it didn't have a disparate impact. But the fact that something having a disparate impact should not be conclusive proof that we throw it out. It may be one has to look at the underlying behaviors and change those rather than throwing out the standards.
Let's talk about the third part of your three-part indictment of the pursuit of equity, which is you say it's costing lives, it's threatening lives, it's undermining the rule of law. Do you want to expand on that a little bit of what you're concerned about there? I mean, this is the author of The War on Cops I'm talking to here. This is the woman who coined the term, the Ferguson effect. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about what you're concerned about in the area of law, crime, policing, and so on.
Well, again, we've decided we'd rather not enforce the law than enforce it in a neutral, colorblind fashion and have a disparate impact on Blacks. So everything, if anybody's been paying attention and maybe just Fox News viewers out to what's going on in the criminal law system, criminal enforcement system since the George Floyd riots, with prosecutors declining to prosecute whole categories of crime, whether it's turnstile jumping or shoplifting or theft or loitering or disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, which is the most appalling, drug possession, drug sales, even gun possession. Why are prosecutors not prosecuting? Why are police chiefs often saying, well, we're not going to enforce traffic laws any longer? It's all because of disparate impact. And this has resulted in this unwinding of law enforcement, which you're right. Thank you for the Ferguson effect credit, Glenn. What we saw post George Floyd was either Ferguson effect 2.0 or the Minneapolis effect, which has been so much worse than the initial iteration of the Ferguson effect, which is the combined phenomenon of officer depolicing, backing off of proactive enforcement and the resulting emboldening of criminals. After George Floyd, the United States saw its largest one-year increase in homicide in its history, 29% one-year increase. And I don't need to tell you, Glenn, that a 29% one-year change in any kind of field is a very, very large statistical change. And the primary victims of that increase in homicide have been Black. We now have Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of white and Hispanic between the ages of 10 and 24. That's a civil rights problem that our civil rights activists do not want to talk about because the people who are killing Blacks at 25 times the rate of whites between the ages of 10 and 24 are themselves overwhelmingly, like with almost zero exceptions, Black. And bizarrely, we've decided that the civil rights activists have decided that they care more about Black criminals than Black victims. That's not intuitively obvious why that should have been the case, but that is what's the case. And so we are dismantling prosecution. We are dismantling incarceration because we don't want to put more Black criminals in prison. The result is the loss of more Black lives. And nobody wants to talk about that loss of Black lives because doing so in an honest fashion would mean talking about Black criminals. And we don't want to do that.
Let me, again, in the interest of trying to conjure up what the other side of this argument might be, Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. This was a book of, 2012, 2013, something like that. That was a big bestseller, and she alleged, in effect, that mass incarceration was a latter-day instantiation of a long-standing American contempt for Black people and relegation of Black people to the bottom of the heap. Whatever you might, and I think I can guess what you might think of that argument, but and you should say if you want, might there not be something to the idea that I have a war on drugs because I'm concerned about the effects of certain kinds of substances on the young people in my society, and I want to extirpate the use or limit as much as I can the use of these dangerous substances, cocaine and heroin and methamphetamines. So I have a war on drugs. When I enforce the war on drugs, I disproportionately end up incarcerating people from certain communities who are themselves more likely to be involved in the drug trafficking at the retail commercial level, although they may not be any more likely to be users of drugs than others in the society. In particular, inner city Black and Latino young men who have poorly educated and don't have alternative employment prospects are disproportionately drawn to the drug trafficking. So when I enforce the law against drugs, I end up locking them up. Now, if I were talking about prostitution and I focused on street level purveyors of sexual services, I'd end up locking up a lot of poor women, as opposed to locking up the Johns who constitute the other side of that market. Might I not, in the interest of racial equity, forbear in some of my punitive response to drug use in the society on the argument that even if I enforce the law without racial bias, the consequence of doing so will be to criminalize a identifiable and severely disadvantaged segment of my population, just as if I were to enforce by locking up street providers of sexual services laws against prostitution, I would mainly criminalize desperate and severely disadvantaged women. There are other ways of responding to the problem of drugs. I don't necessarily have to be as punitive in the way in which I respond. And the motivation of racial equity in me being a little bit less punitive is a perfectly legitimate ethical argument to make. Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, you're asking several things, and I know that you've covered this ground a lot, and your viewers already know this. But first of all, I mean, just the impetus for the war on drugs has almost always come from the Black community itself. James Fortner's written about this. At the Yale Law School, his name is
Foreman and Fortner. Michael Fortner and James Foreman. Michael Fortner's book is called The Silent Black Majority, and Fortner's book is called Locking Up Our Own. But they both make the point that you're making, which is anti-drug law enforcement coming from Black people complaining about the effects on their communities of drug trafficking.
Right. And Foreman writes about the crack cocaine war, which so again came out of the Congressional Black Caucus. So there was a perception that drug use as well as drug trafficking was destroying those admirable, essential institutions of bourgeois respectability that Blacks had built up in the face of the most ugly, contemptible segregation and contempt from the white community. And it was a sense of, we have to do something about this. We're being destroyed by this drug use. Nobody would be complaining about drug enforcement if it didn't have a disparate impact. But the fact that something having a disparate impact should not be conclusive proof that we should throw it out. It may be that it's still, one has to look at the underlying behaviors and change those rather than throwing out the standards. So
does that mean that if the Black community had strenuously objected to the criminalization of drug trafficking, that you would have respected that objection as being relevant to the question of whether or not we should enforce anti-drugs laws?
Possibly. Well, I mean, we're sort of, the question is who, it's always a question, who speaks for that community? And right now you can say that, well, some portion of the Black community, according to the activists, are saying stop enforcing all laws. I can go to a police community meeting in the South Bronx or Central Harlem, and what I hear from the good people that show up to those community meetings is we want more enforcement. I've heard people say, I smell marijuana in my apartment corridor. Can't you do something about it? Or there's people smoking weed that I can see out my window at hanging out at the club. Why can't you get them off the street? So who are you speaking for? Now, that's a problem that you could say for any kind of political action. And there's always buying groups that purport to represent the people. But so I guess I would say that, well, I guess, yes, law enforcement, the degree to which we want the police to be proactive is a political judgment. And if we have a functioning political system, yes, you can ask for more or less law enforcement. I would just say that the victims, when we back off of enforcement, because enforcement has a disparate impact, the victims are disproportionately Black. And maybe we don't care about that. It seems like we don't. If you talk about crime in a colorblind fashion, if you don't even talk about race, you will still be accused of sending out a racist dog whistle by the New York Times or CNN, which is an interesting admission on their part, because you can say, well, I didn't talk about race. Well, but you're being a racist. So somehow the left knows something there that it's not letting on, that if you are talking about urban street crime, the sad fact of the matter is you are talking overwhelmingly about Black victims and Black perpetrators. So.
Yeah, we're getting to the end, I think, here, but I want to ask you about the chapter in your book on the trial of Derek Chauvin, which I thought was very disturbing. The point that you make compellingly was very disturbing. And I want to get you to talk about it a little bit. So we were all on pins and needles awaiting the verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And everybody was braced for the possibility of violent civil disorder in the aftermath of that trial. That jury came back with a guilty verdict, and the worst possible outcomes were avoided. And yet, the idea that that jury bore the burden of knowing that the consequences of its deliberation quite possibly could have triggered massive civil unrest, loss of life, and destruction of property on a national basis makes one wonder whether or not it was possible for Derek Chauvin to get a fair trial at all, and then causes one to wonder further whether or not the very rule of law is being undermined by our concern about people's insistence on what they understand to be racial equity. Am I reading you correctly there? And what do you make of this as a general commentary on the state of the rule of law in American society today?
Well, you're right. If you're a police officer, it'd be a very scary thing right now to face a criminal trial, rightly or wrongly, because there is this threat of riots. Fred Siegel, who's also associated with the Manhattan Institute, wrote about this years ago and talked about the riot ideology, which, yeah, and I'm going to be very frank here, Glenn, is the sense that Blacks sort of get somewhat of a free pass in rioting. And we all kind of expect that if there's an issue involving Blacks and the police, that there's hangs over that always the threat of riots. And it seems like this is asymmetrical. It's not something we worry about if a white person has been killed by the police, but if a Black person has been killed by the police, there's always that threat. And so it is a question every jury has to worry. The barricades go up, the National Guard is put on alert, that if you do acquit on the basis of the evidence, if you feel that there is not, overwhelming probable cause to find guilt, or and you just can't bring yourself to make that judgment, and the city or the nation goes up in fire, that's on you. It's on your conscience. So I don't know what you do about it. I really don't. But for police officers, it is very scary. And this is just another reason why they're disengaging. That post George Floyd, there has been a flight from the profession. The recruiting is over in the United States for police. Nobody wants to join a profession where you're deemed a racist by definition from your first day on the job, and the amount of retirements, early retirements, attrition is extraordinary. So police departments are way understaffed across the country, which creates a vicious cycle of officers knowing they're not going to get backup if they have a confrontation that goes bad. So they're even less likely to proactively engage. So it's a very bad cycle we're in right now. And I don't know. I mean, we sort of let it get out of hand after the George Floyd race riots, where a lot of politicians were unwilling to forthrightly condemn this. There was a lot of hemming and hawing going on about, well, we have to understand the anger, and whether we had been more forceful from the start and say no degree of sense of outrage justifies you destroying somebody's business. That business owner is not responsible for whatever you're angry about. If we'd been more forceful in putting down the riots, maybe it would have helped, but I don't know. But you're absolutely right. This is something to be worried about.